Never trust the idea that your past is buried, especially when it walks straight into your boardroom wearing a bespoke suit, carrying a concealed sidearm, and smelling exactly like the storm that once flooded your whole life. I hired a bodyguard to keep a stranger away from me. Instead, I let the one man I had never stopped dreaming about walk right back through my front door. My name is William Calloway. At 26, I was the youngest chief executive Vienna's wine and spirits world had ever produced, heir to Calloway and Rousseau, 3 centuries of vineyards stretching from the Wachau Valley to the hills above Salzburg. I ran the company in tailored charcoal gray suits, wearing an expression no one could read, with enough military-grade suppressant serum in my bloodstream to guarantee that not one person in that boardroom had ever guessed I was an Omega. In my world, that word was a weakness with a price tag on it. Alphas circled it the way sharks circle blood in water. I had spent 8 years sanding down every soft edge in myself so that no one could ever see through me. Every morning began the same way, a subcutaneous dose of Diloxin 4 at exactly 7:15, before I'd even had my first sip of coffee. It was a ritual I had repeated so many thousands of times that it no longer felt like a choice at all. It was simply part of the armor, no different from a tie or a wristwatch. I once believed I had won. I once believed that if I suppressed it deeply enough, for long enough, that instinctive of me would simply die, like a plant left too long in the dark. I was wrong. It would take a few more weeks before I understood that. 3 weeks before this story begins, someone started leaving me gifts. The first was a bouquet of white roses, already withered, arranged neatly on the hood of my car, inside a garage that required 4 separate keycards to enter. I stood staring at it for a long time before calling building security, trying to convince myself it was just someone's clumsy joke, maybe a drunk employee after a company party. The second was a photograph, slid under the door of my apartment at midnight, taken from the street, of me asleep with the curtains open. The angle made it clear that whoever took it had stood there, in the dark, watching me sleep, for minutes, maybe longer. I didn't sleep for 3 nights after that. And finally, on a gray Tuesday morning, my assistant, Henry, 24, endlessly composed, the only person besides me who knew what I truly was, walked into my office holding an envelope as though it might bite him. Inside was a scarf I'd lost weeks earlier, now soaked in a thick, aggressive alpha scent that belonged to no one I knew. A note was pinned to it. "You smell like something that's been left unclaimed too long, William. I intend to fix that." The police called it harassment and offered to send a patrol car past my building twice a night. That was not going to be enough. Our private security consultants eventually matched the scent trail to a name, Edmond Castellane, a Belgian financier whose fortune had quietly collapsed the year before, and whose interest in me had curdled from professional rivalry into something with teeth. I needed a wall between myself and that man. So Henry called Sentinel Group, the only security firm in Europe that hired exclusively former Special Operations Alphas, and I asked for their best. I did not, in fact, ask for a name. If I had known, I might have asked for anyone else on Earth. I had, in fact, prepared a small speech for the occasion. I'd practiced it twice in front of the mirror that morning, the cold, level voice of a man clearly in charge, a man who would tolerate a bodyguard the way one tolerates a persistent cough. "You are furniture with a pulse. You speak when spoken to. You will not touch my desk, my calendar, or my personal space." I had been rather proud of it. Unfortunately, I delivered the entire thing to the wrong man. He walked into my outer office at the exact moment I stormed out of mine, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothing that could pass for tactical gear if you didn't look too closely. I did not look too closely. I saw an alpha-shaped shadow filling my doorway and I launched straight in. "Listen to me very carefully," I said, jabbing a finger at his chest, "because I will only say this once. You are not my friend. You are not my confidant. You will not offer opinions on my schedule, my coffee order, or my love life, which does not exist and is none of your business regardless. Are we clear?" The man blinked at me, utterly bewildered, still clutching a paper bag that smelled unmistakably of pastry. I'm here to see Henry. I brought him lunch." Behind me, Henry made a sound like a man quietly dying of secondhand embarrassment. "William, that's Felix, my boyfriend." I had, in fact, just threatened my assistant's boyfriend over a bag of strudel. A slow, low laugh rolled out from the doorway behind Felix, not loud but textured, like gravel shifting underfoot. The kind of laugh that raised the hair on my arms before I even understood why. I turned, already dreading it, and found the real reason my morning was about to become unrecognizable. He was leaning against the frame, arms crossed, having clearly witnessed the entire humiliating performance. Black suit, no tie, a jaw that looked carved rather than grown, and eyes so dark they seemed to swallow the office light whole. He was too large for the doorway to properly contain, and when his gaze finally landed on me, the amusement in it sharpened into something else entirely. Recognition raw and immediate, like a name spoken aloud after 5 years of silence. The scent hit me half a second later, cedar and ozone, the electric smell of a storm about to break. My whole body went still. I knew that scent. I had spent 5 years pretending I didn't, burying it under ambition, under suppressants, under a career built like a fortress. My mouth opened, and nothing came out at all. "Mr. Calloway," he said, and his voice hadn't shifted a single degree in 5 years. Sentinel Group sent their lead operative as requested. "You can call me Agent Voss." I did not, in that moment, call him Agent Voss. "Richard," I said instead, the name tasting like something swallowed wrong. To understand why a single name could unravel my composure in the middle of my own office, it's probably necessary to go back to Heidelberg. Richard Voss had been a broke engineering student back then, living off a scholarship, working 2 part-time jobs to get by. One at a cafe near the dormitories, another at a gym where he taught evening fitness classes. I met him at a seminar on applied economics that I'd only signed up for out of curiosity, while he'd been dragged there by a roommate because there was free food. We ended up sitting next to each other by chance. I asked to borrow a pen. He handed me a pencil with a broken tip, apologized profusely, and then laughed, and that was the first time I heard that laugh, the low, textured laugh that would still leave me paralyzed in my own office 5 years later. We were inseparable for the 2 years that followed. He didn't know who I was, didn't know about Calloway and Rousseau, didn't know about the vineyards, didn't know about the surname that should have made him wary. To him, I was just William, a business student who studied too late into the night, who liked his coffee bitter and hated the smell of roses because my mother had planted an entire rose garden before she died. He remembered every small detail like that, as though it mattered more than the figures on the balance sheets I stayed glued to every evening. We used to talk about the future the way only the young dare to, without hedging, without weighing the costs. He wanted to start his own engineering firm. I wanted, though I never said it aloud, to live a life where I didn't have to hide myself behind a layer of suppressants. I had believed, as sincerely as I have ever believed anything, that we would be together forever, until the night of our graduation party, a night that dissolved into fever and static and an ache at the back of my neck that I never let any doctor examine too closely. When I woke the next afternoon, he was gone. No note, no message, only a raised, silver-white scar under my collar that I told myself, for 5 years, was nothing. Now that nothing was standing in my office, in a suit that fit him like a threat, introducing himself as though we had never shared a bed, a future, a single unrepeatable summer. "Is this a joke?" I said, my voice thinner than I wanted it to be. "Out of every alpha in this city they sent you, your safety is my only priority, Mr. Calloway." Not a flicker of emotion on his face. "Granite, Nathaniel," I started, furious at the slip. Furious that I'd nearly called him by a name I hadn't let myself say in years. "William. I go by William. You'd know that if you'd stayed long enough to ask." Something moved behind his eyes, quick and dark, gone before I could name it. "You're being hunted by a man who has already proven he'll break into your home," he said. "History between us has no bearing on keeping you alive. No bearing." The words landed like a slap. He had vanished without a trace and left me convinced I'd imagined the whole of us, and now he stood here reciting professional boilerplate as though I were a stranger he'd been assigned to protect, not someone he had once known by heart. But Edmund Castelaine was closing in and looking at Richard, cold, controlled, radiating the kind of quiet danger that made even the furniture seem to hold its breath. I knew exactly why Sentinel had sent him. "Fine," I said, arms crossed to hide the tremor in my hands. "You work for me, nothing more. From this point forward, we are perfect strangers." The smile that ghosted across his mouth vanished so quickly I nearly missed it. Dark, private, entirely too pleased with itself. His eyes dropped, just briefly, to the collar of my shirt, to the place where a scar hid beneath expensive cotton. "Of course, Mr. Calloway," he said. "I'll be your shadow. You won't even notice I'm there." It was, unmistakably, both a promise and a threat. He moved into my apartment that same evening, a glass tower above the Ringstrasse that had always felt, until that night, like the one place in Vienna entirely mine. Within 2 hours he had swept every room for listening devices, replaced every lock with biometric hardware that was vaguely terrifying, and informed me, with the flat certainty of a man discussing the weather, that the connecting door between his guest room and my bedroom would remain unlocked at all times. "Protocol," he said, before I could even finish opening my mouth to object. "If Castellane breaches the building, I need to reach you in under 4 seconds." "You could reach me in 4 seconds even with the door locked," I said. "You're apparently capable of removing doors from their hinges." I'd rather not test that theory at 3 in the morning. I had no response to that, which I suspected was exactly his intention. Living with Richard Voss turned out to be a very specific kind of torment. I was still on my daily dose of Diloxin-4, the suppressant that had kept every trace of my omega biology dormant for the better part of a decade. But around him, the medication seemed to develop a sense of humor of its own. Every time his fingers brushed mine passing a coffee cup, something sparked up my arm like static before a storm. Every time he stood a half step behind me in the elevator, close enough that I could feel the heat coming off him, my pulse did something it had no business doing. At my age, in my position, in this carefully constructed life of mine, and the scar. For 5 years it had simply been scar tissue, a story I told myself about a reckless graduation night. Now it burned, low, insistent, an itch too deep beneath the skin to reach. I caught myself pressing my palm to my own collar at least a dozen times a day, as if I could smother whatever had woken up in there. He noticed, of course. He noticed everything, but he never once mentioned it, which was somehow worse than if he had. There were lighter moments, too, the kind that snuck up and caught me off guard, standing at the kitchen counter one morning while Richard, in a t-shirt instead of his usual black suit armor, methodically rearranged my entire spice cabinet according to what he called operational logic. "There is no reason," I informed him, "for cinnamon to be filed under threat assessment. Cinnamon is flammable in bulk," he said without turning around. "I filed it under hazards." "You filed the paprika right next to it." "Paprika is also technically a hazard, Mr. Calloway. To your sinuses." I had no answer for that either, and I was beginning to suspect this too was becoming a pattern. Later that evening, when I went to make myself a cup of tea before bed, I discovered he had rearranged the knife drawer as well, ranked by damage potential. As he explained with total seriousness, the fillet knife placed first because thin edge, faster soft tissue trauma. "You're turning my kitchen into an armory," I said. "Your kitchen was always an armory," he replied. "I'm just organizing it more sensibly." There was another evening, when I was working late in the living room, when he brought me a cup of tea I hadn't asked for, exactly the way I liked it, exactly the right temperature, though I had never told him any of that since he'd come back into my life. I stared at the cup for a long time before drinking it, trying to find a reasonable explanation for how he knew, precisely, that I liked a spoonful of honey, no sugar, a thin slice of lemon on the side rather than squeezed in. "You remember," I said finally, not a question. "I remember everything about you," he said, his voice dropping half a register. Then, as though realizing what he'd just revealed, he turned and left the room before I could answer. I sat there long after he'd gone, the tea cooling in my hands, wondering how much of the past 5 years had truly ended, and how much was simply waiting, silent, beneath the thin ice of the polite formalities we kept imposing on each other. About 10 days after Richard moved in, I woke from a nightmare. Edmund, his hand, the smell of stale tobacco mixed with something rotting sweet, and sat up gasping, my heart hammering in my chest. The connecting door burst open before I'd even called his name. "I'm here," Richard said, already standing in the doorway, shirtless, hair disheveled, eyes scanning the room for threats before landing on me. "What happened?" "It's nothing," I said, my voice still shaking. "A dream. He didn't leave." He came in and sat down on the edge of the bed, keeping a careful distance, close enough that I could feel the warmth off him, far enough that he wouldn't touch me without permission. "Tell me," he said, his voice far gentler than the business-like tone he used during the day. I told him about Edmund, about his hand, about the fear that had been simmering beneath my hardened executive shell for 3 weeks. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening a little more with every sentence. "He won't touch you," he said when I finished. "I won't let that happen." "You can't promise that," I said. I just did, he replied simply, as though it were an indisputable fact rather than a comfort. I looked at him in the faint pre-dawn light, and in that moment 5 years seemed to collapse into nothing at all. My hand, almost without my permission, reached out and took his on top of the blanket. He went rigid, just for a heartbeat, and then squeezed back gently. We sat like that, saying nothing more, until the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, and he stood, wished me a polite good morning, and closed the connecting door behind him, but did not lock it. 2 weeks passed, and the city's biggest charity gala arrived, a black-tie evening at the Palais Ferstel that I couldn't skip without inviting exactly the kind of questions I'd spent my whole career avoiding. Vienna's elite tracked my every move. A 26-year-old CEO absent from the year's biggest charity event would be the subject of gossip for a month. Richard wore a tuxedo with an earpiece tucked so discreetly into his hair that only someone who had once counted every one of his features by candlelight would have noticed it. I wore navy silk, my hair combed back into the armor of a man who had never once in his life needed protecting. Before we left the apartment, Richard spent nearly an hour reviewing the route. Entrances, exits, the position of every guard, the guest list cross-checked twice. He didn't say much, but the tension beneath his professional exterior was so obvious that I could feel it through the vague, unnamed thread that had begun quietly forming between us. Castellane's banned from this event, I reminded him as our car pulled into the city center. Men like him don't care about bans, Richard said, eyes still fixed on the window, scanning every corner. He only cares about opportunity. The ballroom was a hothouse of expensive perfume and loud ambition, chandeliers throwing gold light across a sea of alphas and carefully disguised omegas. I was 3 sentences into a conversation about export tariffs when the air beside me changed. "William, you look absolutely delicious tonight." Edmund Castelaine wasn't supposed to be within 100 meters of that building. He had been quietly blacklisted from every high society event in Vienna for nearly a year, and yet there he stood, bourbon in hand, smiling at me as though I already belonged to him. "You shouldn't be here," I said, keeping my voice low and level, though my hands had gone cold around my champagne glass. "I go where I please," Edmund said, stepping closer, his scent, stale tobacco layered under something cloyingly sweet, like fruit going soft, rolling over me in a wave of nausea. "I told you I was coming to collect. You've hidden behind that desk long enough. Little Omega, it's time someone reminded you what you actually are." His hand closed around my wrist before I could pull back, his grip far stronger than it had any right to be. My skin crawled beneath his fingers. "Let go of me," I said, sharper now, wrenching against a hold that wouldn't budge. "You smell suppressed," he murmured, leaning in far too close, inhaling as though tasting something. "But I can smell what's underneath. I'm going to peel every layer of you back myself, and there isn't a single." He never finished the sentence. A hand, larger, faster, entirely certain of itself, clamped down on the back of his neck and simply removed him from my space, the way one might lift a misbehaving dog by the scruff, step away from him. Richard's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried a low, resonant weight that made 3 separate conversations nearby stutter into silence, that had 2 lesser alphas across the room instinctively shrinking half a step back before they even understood why. The whole room filled, instantly, with the thick, electric scent of an alpha done pretending to be patient. Edmund tried to twist free, sputtering something about who Richard thought he was, and then found himself face first against a cocktail table, glass shattering, Richard's knee planted firmly against his spine. His arm wrenched up at an angle that promised very bad things if he moved another inch. "If you come within 100 meters of him again," Richard said, low enough that only the 3 of us could hear it, "I will not call security. I will make sure no one ever finds enough of you to identify." Edmund went pale and very, very still. Richard hauled him up by the collar and handed him off to 2 approaching guards like a piece of unwanted luggage, and then, only then, turned to me. I was shaking, not entirely from fear, the adrenaline, Edmund's scent, and Richard's furious, protective pheromones flooding the air had all conspired to short-circuit whatever the daloxin was supposed to be holding down. My knees actually buckled. He caught me before I hit the floor. His arms came around my waist and pulled me flush against him, one hand rising instinctively to cradle the back of my head, tucking my face against his shoulder. "I've got you," he said, and something in his voice had cracked open. Every professional done. replaced by a rough, desperate gentleness I hadn't heard in 5 years. "I've got you, Will." His thumb brushed once against the scar beneath my collar. The world came apart. Heat surged through my veins like a struck match catching gasoline. Something that had been sleeping, silent, patient, for 5 entire years, flared to sudden, blinding life in my chest, a thread pulled taut between his body and mine. The ache under my collar didn't vanish so much as resolve, like a held breath finally let go, and with it came memory, unlocked all at once. The fever of that graduation night, Richard's eyes gone dark and glowing above me, the sharp, singular pain of teeth-breaking skin in the exact place my hand had pressed for 5 aching years. He hadn't vanished on some coward's whim. He had marked me first. I looked up into his face and found the bodyguard's mask completely gone, replaced by a man staring at his claimed mate, as though the last 5 years had cost him something unbearable. "You knew," I said, my voice barely a thread. "You've always known." "I claimed what was mine," Richard said, his thumb tracing the scar once more, gentle as an apology. "And I am not leaving you again." The truth did not sit quietly. By the time the limousine pulled away from the Palais, my skin had begun to burn from the inside. The Deloxin, engineered to keep an Omega's system permanently dormant, was now waging open war against a bond that had just violently woken up. My lungs felt like they were closing a fraction at a time. "Richard," I gasped, clawing at my own collar. "Stay with me, Will." His voice had gone military flat, panic held on a very short leash. He tore off his jacket and pressed his palm to my burning cheek. "Driver, Rudolf Innerhaus, now, call ahead. Tell them we have a bonded Omega in acute rejection." The last thing I remembered clearly was the screech of tires, a gurney, and too many white lights. I woke, hours later, in the hushed blue dark of an intensive care ward, hollowed out, weak, and strangely, clearer-headed than I had felt in 5 years. The fog I'd always assumed was simply what adulthood felt like had lifted entirely. Richard sat in the chair beside my bed, elbows on his knees, face in his hands, looking like a man who had personally carried the weight of a collapsing building on his shoulders. "You almost killed me," I said, my voice a ruin. His head snapped up, his eyes were red-rimmed. He didn't reach for me, kept his hands pinned to his own knees as though he no longer trusted them near me. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry, Will. I didn't know what they had you on. If I'd known, I would have found another way to get close to you." "Why did you disappear?" I said, 5 years of careful silence finally cracking open into anger. "And then mark me first? Do you understand what those 5 years did to me? I thought I wasn't enough. I thought I'd imagined all of it." He flinched as though I'd struck him. "Because I was a broke second year with nothing to my name," he said, "and you were the heir to the Calloway estate. The night I lost control and bit you, your grandfather found me outside the dormitories the next morning." My chest went cold. Augustin found out. "He told me a consortium of rivals had put a price on your head," Richard said, his voice thick with old grief. "That an unmarked, unprotected Omega heir was already a target, and a bonded Omega with an unproven, penniless alpha mate would be worse. Leverage, twice over. He gave me a choice. Disappear and let his people protect you in silence, or stay and watch you become a bargaining chip because I had nothing to defend you with. So you left." My voice cracked in the middle of it. "I left to become someone capable of protecting you," he said fiercely. "I joined the army. I trained until I couldn't stand. I joined Sentinel because it gave me the reach your grandfather's people had. I watched from a distance for 5 years, Will. I made sure he kept his word. And then he died 3 years ago, and the protection went with him, and Edmund Castellane started circling less than a year later. I sat with that in silence, tears sliding sideways into the pillow, the anger not gone, but no longer entirely alone. He said he was coming to collect. I said finally, "Why now? The company's healthy. This isn't worth this kind of risk for a man like him." Richard's jaw tightened. He reached into his jacket and produced a heavy, wax-sealed envelope. "It was never about the company. I lifted this from his study during a sweep last week. It's the actual reason he's hunting you." The wax seal bore the old Calloway crest, a wolf's head over crossed grapevines, a detail I had always assumed was purely decorative. My hands shook breaking it open. Inside was a stack of brittle parchment and a heavy iron key, its head engraved with a pattern I didn't recognize. "What is this, a deed?" Richard said quietly. "Your grandfather didn't just leave you a vineyard, Will. Decades ago, Cold War years, he bought a stretch of land deep in the Black Forest and built something underneath it. Not a bunker, a vault." I read the parchment with my pulse climbing. It described a subterranean archive, original unpatented blueprints for a cold fermentation process worth a fortune to the right buyer, alongside untraceable physical assets, gold, bearer bonds, decades of Augustine's paranoid hedging against a world he never trusted. It's real, Richard confirmed. And the only legal way to claim it is through direct bloodline inheritance, except for one clause buried deep in the old regional inheritance statutes. A formally bonded mate gains joint claim. The horror of it landed all at once. If I'm bonded, I said slowly, you would have a legal claim to everything inside. Which means, Richard said, his eyes going cold, that whoever bonds you gets it. Castellane's company is quietly bankrupt, Will. He found out about the vault before I did. He was never going to be satisfied with just marking you and walking away. He needs a signature, and a completed bond gives him the legal standing to force one. Then he won't stop, I said, gripping the key until the engraving bit into my palm. Not now that he knows. No, Richard agreed, the old tactical coldness sliding back over his face like a visor closing. So we don't wait for him. We go to the vault, we secure it, and we lock him out permanently. I looked at the man across from me, the boy I'd loved at 19, rebuilt over 5 brutal years purely for the right to stand beside me again, and felt something in my chest finally settle into place. I'm done hiding, I said, throwing off the hospital blanket. Get me my clothes, Richard. We're going to the forest. 3 days later we were airborne, a chartered helicopter cutting low over the black, rain-soaked canopy of the Schwarzwald, the storm outside matching the static charge in the cabin. I wore field gear that felt like a costume from someone else's life, the iron key on a chain against my sternum. Richard sat across from me, checking a rifle magazine with the calm of a man doing simple arithmetic. Before we boarded, Henry had called me one last time, his voice tense over the phone. I found Castellane's financial records, he said. His company's drowning in debt, not just bankrupt, but under investigation for fraud in 3 countries. He has nothing left to lose, William. Be careful. We will be, I said, though we both knew it was a fragile promise. Felix wants me to remind you, Henry added, his voice softening slightly, that even though you still owe him an apology for the strudel incident, he's hoping you come back safe so he can keep teasing you about it. I laughed, the first laugh in days, and felt a little lighter for it. We landed a mile out and hiked in through driving rain, mud dragging at every step. Richard moved like something poured rather than walking, every sense pinned wide open, and through the bond, faint but unmistakable now, I could feel it too. The sharp spike of his adrenaline, the fierce, wordless need radiating off him to put himself between me and anything that moved. Close, he murmured finally, pulling me down behind an old redwood. Entrance is under the cellar of the hunting lodge. The lodge itself was a rotting, centuries-old skeleton half swallowed by forest, and as we crept toward its sagging porch, a second scent cut through the storm, stale tobacco, and something gone soft and sweet with rot. He's here, Richard hissed, shoving me behind him and raising the rifle. A spotlight snapped on, blinding. Laughter rolled out of the dark porch. Edmund Castelaine stepped into the light flanked by 4 armed men, a revolver loose in his hand. Knew the little Omega couldn't resist coming to see his new toys, Edmund sneered. Thank you for bringing the key, William. Saves me tearing your apartment apart for it. It's over, Castelaine, Richard said, his voice carrying that same low room-silencing weight from the ballroom, and even here in the rain 2 of the mercenaries flinched. You're trespassing on private land. Drop the weapons and you might still walk out of this forest. Big talk from a hired dog, Edmund spat. Kill the Alpha. Bring me the Omega. I'll finish the bond myself, right here in the mud, if that's what it takes. The gunfire that followed was deafening. Richard tackled me sideways off the porch and behind a stone retaining wall a half-second before bullets shredded the wood where we'd been standing. Stay down, he barked, pulling a flashbang from his vest, yanking the pin and lobbing it over the wall. The flash and concussion rattled the ground under my knees. He didn't hesitate after that. He went over the wall like something unleashed, and I heard it more than I saw it. The crack of bone, shouts cut short, the sound of a man dismantling 4 armed opponents through sheer trained brutality. When I finally risked a look, Richard had already put 2 of them down, his knife a flicker of dim light in the rain, moving as though every ounce of the last 5 years had been spent for exactly this moment. Which was, of course, the moment Edmund used the chaos to slip around the flank. He grabbed my vest from behind and hauled me away from the wall, pressing the revolver's barrel to my temple. "Let's go, little Omega. Open the vault or I redecorate this forest with your brains." The panic that rose in me this time wasn't the paralyzing kind. The bond was fully open now, and I could feel Richard's fury like a beacon lit somewhere behind my ribs. I didn't need to wait to be rescued. I drove my elbow back into Edmund's ribs with everything I had. He grunted, his grip loosening a fraction. Enough. I spun, swept his leg, and his knee buckled sideways with a sound that turned my stomach. The revolver fired wildly into the storm. Before he could recover, a shadow the size of a small building landed on top of him. It wasn't so much a fight as a verdict. Richard's fists came down until Edmund stopped moving, bleeding quietly into the mud. Richard stood, breathing hard, rain sluicing the blood off his knuckles, and turned to me with an expression caught somewhere between fury and terror. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," I said, reaching up to press my palm against his rain-slick cheek. Warmth rolled through the bond between us, soothing something raw in both of us at once. "You stopped him, Richard." We zip-tied Edmund and his surviving men and called Sentinel for extraction and cleanup. Then, finally, we went down into the cellar and turned the iron key. The vault door groaned open onto a pristine underground archive untouched by decades, rows of servers, stacked gold, sealed files, all of it lit in cool white light. My grandfather's paranoia, made real and entirely mine. Standing in the middle of it, surrounded by more wealth than I would ever need, none of it mattered even slightly. I turned to Richard, the man who had spent 5 years dismantling and rebuilding himself purely for the right to stand in this room beside me, and felt the words come easily, for the first time in longer than I could remember. "You didn't have to do any of this," I said, stepping closer. He reached out and traced the healed scar at my collar, gentle as a question. Under his fingers, the old mark hummed, finally, fully accepted. "I would burn down every forest in this country to keep you safe, Will," he said. "The vault, the company, none of it means anything without you in it." I kissed him, 5 years condensed into one motion, relief, forgiveness, and the particular, quiet surrender of a man who had finally stopped waiting to be left again. The past at last stayed buried. Cleaning up the aftermath of a gunfight in the Black Forest turned out to be far more complicated than the gunfight itself. Sentinel Group sent in a crisis team to coordinate with local police, and over the following 3 days, I learned that money, while it couldn't solve everything, certainly made the paperwork move a great deal faster. Edmund Castellane was arrested on the spot, and with the financial fraud records Henry had already dug up, he faced charges across 3 separate countries: kidnapping, armed assault, and a long list of financial crimes enough to keep him behind bars for years to come. "That man will never set foot in a European ballroom again," Henry told me over the phone, sounding thoroughly pleased with himself. "I made sure of it." "What did you do?" I asked, a little wary. "Nothing illegal," Henry reassured me. "Just a great many phone calls to a great many people who know the right people." I didn't ask further. Meanwhile, Richard and I spent most of our time at the lodge in the forest, waiting for the legal proceedings around the vault to be finalized. They were among the strangest days of my life. No board meetings to attend. No quarterly reports to review, just rain falling on the old wooden roof and Richard always somewhere in sight, even though he no longer needed to protect me from anything. "You can stop standing guard at the window now," I told him on the second night, catching him staring out at the dark tree line through the kitchen window. "Hard habit to break," he admitted, but didn't move from the spot. I walked up behind him, wrapped my arms around his waist, pressed my cheek to his back. "There's no one left to guard against, Richard." He turned in my arms, and in the firelight I saw something in him finally loosen. Not a bodyguard's vigilance, but the peace of a man finally allowed to stay still. "Then I suppose," he said, his voice going rough, "I'll have to find something else to do with these hands." We returned to Vienna 3 weeks later, the iron key locked safely in a private bank vault, along with a new set of legal documents confirming Richard's joint ownership of the archive beneath the Black Forest. Though, as he made clear more than once, he had no interest in a single ounce of the gold inside it. "So what do you want?" I asked him as we sat in the lawyer's office, waiting to sign the last of the paperwork. "I already have it," he said, not taking his eyes off me. The company continued running smoothly under my direction, though I now worked with a lightness I hadn't known was possible. No longer constantly checking over my shoulder, no longer wondering when the next bouquet would appear on the hood of my car. Richard formally left Sentinel Group 3 months later, though he stayed in close contact with his old team. They still called him in to consult on particularly difficult cases, and he still often said yes, though now with the clear condition that he'd be home every night. Home had come to mean something different to me since then. Not just the glass tower above the Ringstrasse, but wherever Richard was, whether that apartment, the lodge in the forest, or the chair beside a hospital bed where he had once sat, head buried in his hands, begging for a forgiveness I had, in the end, given him completely. We married the following spring, in the very vineyard above the Wachau, where the Calloway family had cultivated grapes for 3 centuries. Henry insisted on decorating the wedding arbor with an overwhelming number of white roses, until Richard fell silent for a full minute before admitting, grudgingly, that he no longer actually minded them. They used to be a threat, he explained to me, standing beneath the arbor on the morning of the wedding, his fingers brushing a petal. Now they're just flowers. You're getting sentimental, Richard Voss, I teased him. Only with you, he replied, pulling me closer. Felix cried through the entire ceremony, and at the reception he attempted to give a toast that somehow turned into a 20-minute story about the old pastry incident, ensuring I would never live down my reputation as the man who once threatened a strudel delivery. You did threaten me, Felix says at least once a month, entirely too pleased with himself. I threatened your pastries, I always correct him. There's a difference. That night, once the reception had finally wound down and the last guests had gone, Richard found me standing alone among the vines, watching moonlight throw long shadows across the rows of earth my family had tended for generations. What are you thinking about? He asked, wrapping his arms around me from behind. I was thinking, I said, leaning back against his chest, that 5 years ago I thought I would never have this. Any of this, you always had it, Richard said, his lips brushing my temple. It just took a while to find the way back around. A few months after the wedding, Richard began restoring the lodge in the Black Forest, a project he approached with the same tactical precision he'd once used to sweep my apartment for listening devices, except this time the enemy was rotted wood and a sinking foundation. You don't have to do all of this yourself, I told him, standing in the doorway watching him hoist a heavy wooden beam onto his shoulder, sweat and dust covering him head to toe. I know, he said, not stopping. I want to. There was a particular satisfaction in watching Richard build something with his own 2 hands, after so many years spent tearing things down, enemies, threats, himself, over and over, rebuilt into a weapon sharp enough to protect me. Now, watching him carefully set each stone into place, I thought I understood why he needed this. Not because the lodge needed fixing, but because he needed to prove to himself that he could build as well as destroy. Do you think, I asked Henry over the phone one evening, while Richard slept, and I sat alone on the porch of the slowly rebuilding lodge, that he'll ever stop feeling like he has to prove something? I don't think, Henry said after a pause, that's something he needs to stop. It's just how he loves. He builds things to keep them safe, including himself. I thought about that for a long time after hanging up, watching moonlight fall across the tree line, and decided I would never try to change that in Richard. Only learn to live alongside it, the way a tree learns to live beside the storm that once broke it, and finds its roots dug in deeper for it. The hunting lodge in the Black Forest no longer looked like a ruin. Richard had rebuilt it himself, mostly with his own hands, and an amount of stubbornness I found both maddening and, honestly, unbearably attractive, stone by stone, until the place that had once hidden a vault now simply hid us, twice a year, from the noise of Vienna. We had married the previous spring, in the vineyard above the Wachau, under an arbor Henry insisted on decorating with so many white roses that Richard had gone very quiet for a full minute before admitting, grudgingly, that he actually didn't mind them anymore. Felix cried through the entire ceremony, and then, at the reception, attempted a toast that somehow became a 20-minute story about the pastry incident, ensuring I never lived down my reputation as the man who once threatened a strudel delivery. You did threaten me, Felix says, at least once a month, entirely too pleased with himself. I threatened your pastries, I always correct him. There's a difference. Richard, for his part, has become smug about exactly one thing in our marriage, and it is this: he was right about the connecting door. I told you, he says, at least once a week, whenever I concede that yes, it is in fact convenient that he can reach me in under 4 seconds protocol. You removed that door's hinges for romantic reasons, Richard, not protocol. I filed it under both. He still rearranges my spice cabinet by threat level, an act of quiet chaos I have stopped fighting, mostly because watching him solemnly explain why the saffron is high value, low risk, is one of my favorite forms of entertainment. He still stiffens, very slightly, whenever an unfamiliar alpha stands too close to me at company events. A full 3 years after Edmund Castelain was quietly and permanently removed from polite society, and 2 years after Richard stopped needing to be paid to guard me at all. You know I can handle myself, I told him last month, at a supplier's dinner, watching him glare a visiting Bordeaux exporter into an early exit. I know, he agreed, entirely unrepentant, sliding an arm around my waist anyway. I simply enjoy handling things first. We don't have children, we never wanted them, and no one in either of our lives has ever thought to ask twice, which suits us fine. What we have instead is this: a rebuilt lodge in a forest that no longer feels haunted, a scar under my collar that hums warm and easy whenever he's near instead of aching, and 5 years of silence that finally, fully, stopped costing either of us anything. Some mornings, I still catch him watching me across the kitchen table the way he did that very first day in my office. Like a man who once lost something he loved and has spent every day since making absolutely certain it never happens twice. What? I ask him. Every time. Nothing, he always says, and then almost every time reaches over to steal the last of my coffee anyway. I let him. Some habits, it turns out, are worth keeping, and some men, once you've finally stopped running from them, are worth every single year it took to get back. Alaric Thornhollow took the throne at 28, so tall the guards had to install a separate, larger door for the throne room, with shoulders that had once single-handedly pushed back an invading army on the northern border. In the court, they called him the Steel Lion, a nickname he never denied, if only because he had never smiled long enough for anyone to doubt it. Until Alara appeared, she was no princess, no noblewoman. She was an orphaned Omega raised in the palace weaving hall, small and thin, with green eyes that always seemed to be apologizing for taking up too much space in the world. Rumor had it the king came across her by chance, mending an old curtain in a dim corridor, and stood there without a word for 10 full minutes, simply watching her work. 6 months later they were married. The whole kingdom couldn't stop whispering about it. On the first night after the wedding, Alara came down with a fever. It was an ordinary cold. Eldenmore's winter rains were always harsh, and she wasn't yet used to the cold stone chambers of the castle, so different from the warm weaving hall she'd grown up in. But when the royal physician brought the news, Alaric rose from his throne in the middle of court, leaving 12 waiting lords behind, and strode toward the bedchamber so fast his cloak billowed out behind him like a gust of wind. "Bring the best physician there is," he ordered, his voice steady, despite the tremor in his hand as he touched her forehead. "It's only a cold, Your Majesty," the physician said, somewhat bewildered by the overreaction. "She only needs rest, then I will make certain she rests." That night, instead of sleeping in the enormous feather bed reserved for the king, Alaric dragged a fur mattress down onto the floor, right beside Alara's bed, and lay there, not for lack of space, but because he wanted to be close enough to hear if her breathing changed in the night. "Your Majesty," Alara whispered, her voice hoarse with fever, struggling to sit up and look down at him lying on the cold stone floor. "This isn't your place." "This is exactly my place," he answered, without opening his eyes. "You're the king? You cannot sleep on the floor like some guard dog." The corner of his mouth twitched upward, rare enough that the ladies-in-waiting would later whisper that no one had ever seen it happen. "If sleeping on the floor to keep you safe makes me a guard dog," he said, "then I volunteer to be the most loyal one this kingdom has ever had." Alara had no answer for that, so she simply lay back down, and in her feverish half-sleep she heard, or perhaps only imagined, him murmuring something in the old tongue, a prayer she didn't understand, but whose earnestness she could feel all the same. By morning, the fever had broken. Alaric was still there, sitting with his back against the bed frame, eyes shadowed from a sleepless night, one hand still holding hers through the gap between the bed and the floor. It was the first time in her life, Alara thought, that someone had chosen to lie lower than her. Not to bow in submission, but to make certain that if she fell, he would always be right there to catch her. For 3 nights straight, Alaric slept on the floor. By the 4th night, With the fever fully gone, and Alara well enough to sit up on her own, she looked down at him, the man who had once made an entire army kneel, now curled up on a thin mattress on the cold stone floor, stubbornly refusing to leave even though she'd recovered. "Your Majesty," she called softly. "I hear you," he answered instantly, though his eyes stayed closed, proof that he hadn't truly slept deeply in 3 whole nights, always poised to spring up the moment she needed him. Slowly, Alara reached down and pressed her palm into his, resting on the floor. He opened his eyes. "If you keep sleeping on the floor like this," she said, her voice still a little hoarse but far steadier now, "I'll have to come down there with you, and then we'll both catch cold, and this entire kingdom will lose both its king and its queen, all over a stone floor. That is not a persuasive reason for me to abandon my post." "Then here," she said, tightening her grip on his hand, "come up to the bed. Not because you're the king and I'm your subject, but because I want you beside me, truly beside me, not at my feet like a sentry." Alaric fell silent for a long moment, his eyes searching her face as though looking for something hidden beneath the words. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice surprisingly quiet for a man who could shout loud enough to shake the entire throne hall. "I have never been more certain of anything," Alara said. "You spent 3 nights on the floor just to make sure I was safe. Now let me make sure you rest too. That isn't weakness, Alaric. It's letting me take care of you the way you took care of me." It was the first time she had ever called him by his name. "Not your Majesty." He rose, slowly, and for the first time in 3 nights climbed into the bed beside her, not with the rigid bearing of a king, but with the near-shy hesitation of a man unaccustomed to being allowed to rest. "Thank you," he whispered, as she rested her head against his chest, "for pulling me up off the floor." "Thank you," she answered, "for teaching me that someone would be willing to lie down there for me." If someone had told Alaric 10 years ago that he would spend his mornings crawling across the throne room floor while a 3-year-old climbed onto his back as though he were a war horse, he would have ordered that person's head removed for the insult. And yet that was exactly what was happening. "Faster, my war horse!" little Rosalind shrieked, both tiny hands clamped around her father's collar, her green eyes, identical to her mother's, bright with excitement. "Charge the eastern castle!" "My dear little princess," Alaric said, struggling to maintain his gravity while crawling slowly across the marble floor, "your warhorse has just eaten a heavy breakfast and requires rest before entering battle. Horses don't get to be lazy." From the doorway, Alara stood watching, one hand resting on a belly already rounding with their second child, the other pressed to her mouth to hide her laughter. "Your Majesty, Steel Lion," she called, fighting back a smile. "The Council of Lords is waiting for you in the main hall." "The council can wait," Alaric answered, not stopping, as Rosalind continued kicking her tiny heels into his sides. "I am currently engaged in a matter of the utmost national importance. What matter is that?" "The conquest," he said, glancing at his daughter, who was waiting for his answer with an expression of total seriousness. "Of the tea table." Rosalind burst into giggles, and the sound of it, bright, unrestrained, entirely free, was the sound that Alaric always believed made his whole life of warfare finally truly worth it. 10 minutes later, when Alaric finally appeared in the main hall, hair thoroughly disheveled, a small pink bow, Rosalind's spoils of war, still pinned crookedly to the shoulder of his royal cloak. The 12 assembled lords looked at him with expressions that dared not ask. "Your Majesty," Duke Calloway ventured cautiously, "you appear to be wearing an ornament." Alaric glanced down, saw the bow, and rather than remove of it as any other king would, simply straightened it. "This is a medal of honor," he said, with perfect seriousness, "awarded by the youngest commander in this kingdom. I wear it with great pride." No one in the council dared laugh, but afterward, rumors of the Steel Lion's pink bow medal spread throughout the court, and people began to say that the king who had once made an entire army kneel now knelt before a 3-year-old girl every single day, and was not the least bit ashamed of it. There was one thing Alaric had never anticipated. Fatherhood frightened him in ways the battlefield never had. The night Rosalind was born, he stood outside the birthing chamber for 14 hours straight, refusing to leave despite his courtiers' pleading, and when he was finally allowed in, saw Alara exhausted but smiling, cradling a tiny, red-faced life in her arms, and the man who had faced down thousands of swords without ever flinching dropped to his knees beside the bed and wept. "I don't know what to do," he confessed to Alara, his voice breaking. I know how to command an army. I don't know how to do this. No one does, Alara said gently, easing the baby into his arms. We'll learn together. And learn they did, through sleepless nights, through Alaric panicking and summoning the physician at 3 in the morning because Rosalind had sneezed twice in a row, through him gradually discovering that there existed an entirely different kind of courage from the courage of the battlefield. The courage required to love something so fragile, knowing the world could harm it in 1,000 ways no sword could ever prevent. Do you know, Alara said to him one night as they both stood by Rosalind's cradle, simply watching her sleep, I think you're more afraid of being a father than you ever were of dying in battle. That's true, Alaric admitted, without hesitation. On the battlefield, I could only lose my own life. Here, he looked down at their sleeping daughter, I could lose something far more precious than my own life. Their second child, a boy named Cedric, was born on a night of heavy winter snow, exactly 3 years after the night Alaric first slept on the floor. And, in a strange echo of fate, it was Alara who fell ill afterward. Not a cold this time, but the exhaustion of a mother newly delivered, her body needing time to recover. Alaric, of course, once again dragged the mattress down onto the floor. Your Majesty, Alara whispered, weak but with a glint of amusement in her eyes, watching him prepare his floor bed just as he had 3 years before. We've already done this, and I am willing to do it as many times as it takes, he replied, arranging the pillows with the same careful precision he might apply to a military strategy. She watched him for a long moment, and then, just as she had that night 3 years earlier, she reached down and pressed her palm into his. Come up to bed, she said, her voice still weak but firm. I've learned how to let you take care of me without you punishing yourself for it. This time, let me hold you, instead of letting you keep watch over me from a distance. Alaric smiled, a full smile, rare, the kind that now only Alara and their 2 children could ever draw out of him, and climbed into bed, wrapping his arms around both her and their newborn son sleeping peacefully between them. 3 years ago, he murmured into her hair, I lay on that floor because I thought it was the only way I knew to protect you. And now I understand that the best way to protect the people we love, he said, isn't to stand guard from a distance, but to be close enough that they know they never have to be alone. 4 years after that night, an ordinary morning at Eldenmore Castle looked like this. Rosalind, now 7, sat at the breakfast table, trying to convince her 4-year-old brother that she was the general, and he was the war horse in their morning conquest of the Toast territory. I'm not a horse, Cedric protested, hurling a piece of toast at his sister, missing and striking Alaric squarely on the head as he bent to tie his son's shoelaces. Someone, Alaric said, straightening up with a crumb of bread stuck in his hair, struggling to maintain a king's stern expression, has just assaulted the sovereign in his own castle. This is high treason. Are you going to chop off my head, Papa? Cedric asked, eyes wide with a mix of fear and delight. I shall. Alaric paused, pretending to deliberate gravely, turns you to be tickled until you beg for mercy. Laughter rang through the breakfast room as the king, who had once terrified his enemies, wrestled with a shrieking, giggling 4-year-old, while Rosalind stood on her chair, declaring herself supreme referee of the conflict. Alara sat at the head of the table, teacup in hand, watching the chaos with a smile she couldn't hide. Do you know, she said, when Alaric finally sat down beside her, his hair still a mess, when I was just a girl mending curtains in a dark hallway, I never once dared to dream of a morning like this. Loud, chaotic, and covered in flying toast? He asked, with a soft laugh. Full of love, she corrected, leaning her head against his shoulder. That's what I never dared to dream of. Not a crown, not a castle, just this. A loud, chaotic family, covered in flying toast. Alaric reached down beneath the table, found her hand, and pressed his palm into hers, the gesture that had become their own private language over the years. A promise repeated wordlessly, again and again. I am here, and I will always be here. Well then, he said, looking around the breakfast room where their 2 children continued their toast war, I believe we've built exactly the thing worth building. Outside the window, the first snow of the season began falling gently over Eldenmore, covering the towers of a castle that had once witnessed countless battles, now echoing only with the laughter of children and the soft clink of teacups every morning. The steel lion of Eldenmore, who once did not know how to smile, now smiled every day, not because a kingdom had been conquered, but because his heart, at last, had found the place it belonged.